35-year-old attorney Oliver Smith, known better by his name of Kermit, was departing a stag event with friends at the Columbia Edgewater Country Club on the north end of Portland. It was only minutes before midnight. Light-heartedly venturing back to his car, he climbed inside, started it up, and the blast was heard for miles around the city. Others at the club flocked to the scene to see a carnage that no man could have survived. The middle portion of the car was gone, the roof thrown 50 yards by the blast, and the shattered windshield thrown closer to 150 yards away. And Smith himself? His body had been thrown violently into the grill of a nearby vehicle. Had it not been so late, and had the club been more full, it's possible others may have perished in relation to this blast, which, based on its power alone, could not have been the result of some random malfunction of Smith's 1952 Buick. This was the work of a saboteur. One of the lucky ones was a former chief criminal deputy district attorney, J. Raymond Karskadon, who'd been invited to the club that night. He would have taken his ride home in Smith's car, but he decided not to go out. A casual night with friends had transitioned to a brutal tragedy before the victim even made it out of the parking lot. Beyond the shock of this event, its timing and the circumstances surrounding it really hit the people around Portland as it presented the peak in a series of bombings and extortion-related events that were happening around the city. It started with the bombing of a vacant third-floor restroom in the Meyer and Frank department store on April 15th. Later, threats were received by the store threatening further bombings if a ransom was not paid out. A week later, and a day after Kermit Smith's death, the wife of a Portland attorney, Herbert Winfrey, received a call demanding money under threat. And that same day, the Sunset Fuel Company received a threat claiming a bomb had been placed in their main fuel tank, while an employee at the J.J. Newberry store got a call from someone who overheard two men in the store claiming they placed a bomb under a counter. These both turned out to be hoaxes. An employee at a store in the Morgan building in downtown, Edward Henson, sent a letter to his employer stating a bomb would go off there on April 26th. When caught, he admitted it was just a prank. Several schools, including Portland State University, as well as Lincoln, Jefferson, and Washington high schools, received bomb threats, all of which were believed to be from students who just wanted some time off of school. These threats even stretched beyond Portland to places like Salem and Baker City. This is what was going on when Kermit Smith's car exploded. The worst thing at the worst time. But most of these other cases were hoaxes, and they were mostly targeted at places as opposed to individual people. None of them were car bombings. So why kill the 35-year-old lawyer in such a way? A man with a wife and children. Perhaps Smith had his own ideas. Only a week earlier, he had obtained a permit to carry a gun. This came after he was attacked at his own home just over a month earlier. On March 10th, in an event that now perhaps bore greater significance, Smith was struck over the head while in his garage by what turned out to be a bottle wrapped inside of a sack. This item was ditched by the attacker a few blocks from Smith's home. He reacted and fought with the attacker, who fortunately decided to run away. In the process, this attacker had dropped a hunting knife on the garage floor as well. Suffering a broken nose and other lacerations, Smith was taken to the hospital, where he told the police that he was pretty sure he knew the man who had attacked him. Victor Lawrence Wolfe, 45. Born in Kansas City, Missouri in 1909, he, like Smith, had served in World War II. He married a Patricia Bell in 1933, later presumably divorcing. I say presumably because I found no evidence that they did. But Wolfe would remarry in 1946 at the age of 36 to a 19-year-old named Iris Wisner. The marriage lasted into the 1950s, but by 1955, Wolfe was on his own again following another divorce. A rough around the edges, somewhat haggard-looking individual, he obtained work as a railroad technician in August 1954. Despite Kermit Smith ultimately identifying Wolfe as his attacker, it seems he just let it go, as Wolfe was never arrested or seemingly even questioned on the matter. This was reportedly due to Smith's wife telling him to just let it go, something that perhaps didn't seem to mean much at the time. But none of this answers the question of why this railroad man would attack our soon-to-be bombing victim. Well, according to Wolfe, he met a woman during the fall of 1954, a woman born Marjorie Jean Evans, in Portland back in 1921. At this time, this woman was going by the name of Marjorie Smith, and she had recently been divorced from her husband, Kermit Smith. Marjorie herself would verify this information, as she had hired Wolfe to run a rooming house that she and Kermit had owned, located on Tillamook Street. Wolfe had moved in there not long after his divorce, which made sense as Marjorie herself would call the place the House of Divorce, considering how many divorced people had lived there. She said that he'd been very helpful, and she even admitted going out on a few dates with him, as she felt sorry for him, as reportedly his last wife had run out on him. Wolfe's take on the situation was a bit more serious, claiming that the two had actually fallen for one another, and it had escalated to the point where he had become, as he called it, a sex slave to her. Things really escalated on Thanksgiving 1954, when he said they went out dancing and she kissed him. As he put it, the next time she kissed him, she was asking him to help kill her husband. This topic was first brought up while Wolfe and Marjorie were reportedly playing a game of Scrabble. From a conventional and predictable place, this could sound both absurd and/or plausible. Many might look at Marjorie and then Victor and think, there's no way she fell in love with this guy. On the flip side, is it possible a guy like him could have been easily manipulated by her? So Victor Wolfe had a pre-existing background, reportedly including romance with the former wife of the man he would later attack in his own garage. This was all very interesting, but the relationship that Marjorie and Kermit shared in those early 50s years only adds to the intrigue. Born himself in Portland in 1920, Smith served in the war, earning a Purple Heart, and then going on to ultimately obtain his law degree from the University of Oregon in 1948. He would even take a shot, unsuccessfully, at running for the Oregon Senate in 1950. Short while on down the road, he met Marjorie Evans, at an airline party shortly after she obtained a job with West Coast Airlines. A friend asked if they could bring a friend, and Kermit Smith was that friend. They hit it off, and Kermit began calling her up. Come 1952, the two were married. Marjorie already had a child from a previous marriage, Gregory, but they kept the family going by having another child named Susan. The two would get divorced in August 1954, with Marjorie meeting Victor Wolfe shortly after. Despite Marjorie making claims of cruel and inhumane treatment from her husband, the two would reconnect and remarry on February 4th, 1955, less than 3 months before Kermit's death. Friends would claim financial problems were a key factor in their divorce, but since getting back together, they appeared quite happy. The family lived at a home on Northeast Alameda Street on the eastern end of the Rose City Park neighborhood. By all accounts, despite a rough past, life at the Smith home had stabilized by the spring of 1955. So why would Victor Wolfe attack Kermit Smith in his own garage? Conventional wisdom suggests if he had developed something serious with Marjorie that he might have bore some resentment towards her husband. But perhaps it went beyond that. And despite the fact that Kermit identified Wolfe as his attacker, on the day before his death, who just happened to be at his home but Victor Wolfe? He had been invited to the Smith home on April 20th to put together a swing set for Kermit's daughter's birthday. It's a wonder why, at this point, either Kermit or Marjorie would invite this man, of all people, to their home for such a menial task. Something didn't seem right in all of this. And being a man with no known enemies, a good place for investigators in Smith's murder to start was with the man who'd attacked him weeks earlier, and was at his home the day before his death. Police were at Wolfe's door within hours of the explosion, knocking at his door in the middle of the night. According to them, Wolfe was not surprised by their arrival. He surprisingly was not a man trying to hold much back. Whisked away to the police station, after a little runaround from Wolfe, who initially claimed he'd been home hours before the bombing, they had a written confession from the man. And it was quite the confession. As mentioned before, Wolfe and Marjorie had met and, even by her account, dated a time or two, with Wolfe saying their connection was much stronger. Love and manipulation. While his confession was only a portion of everything he had to say, that, along with statements he made over the coming days, painted a disturbing picture of the woman who was now a recent widow. But beyond questionable romance, Victor Wolfe confessed that both he and Marjorie Smith plotted out the murder of her husband, the motive being to collect on Kermit's $20,000 life insurance policy. Beyond that, as a whole, the Smiths had an estate in the $50,000 to $60,000 range. They take the money and then flee to Alaska. While this last part of the story seems a bit out there, several Alaska-themed books were later found in Wolfe's car. Of course, if his story was made up to take the widow down with him, it would have been easy to toss a few Alaska books into his car. Obviously, after all of this, he also admitted to being the one responsible for rigging Kermit's car to explode that night. He did this by placing dynamite he had obtained under the car's driver's seat, and he did this while he was supposedly at the Smiths' home to put together a swing set. Meanwhile, Marjorie kept Kermit distracted inside the house. So likely, either Marjorie smoothed things over between Wolfe and her husband, or she tried to make it so Kermit wouldn't even know Wolfe was there. Something fairly risky. After installing the explosives at the Smith home, Wolf then went to the country club while Kermit was inside, at which time he actually rigged the explosives to go off once Kermit started the car. The Wilson family, in a car passing by the country club that night, said that they saw a car speed out of the club's parking lot onto Marine Drive just moments before the car exploded. Some believe that this was Wolf speeding away from the scene. However, Wolf himself said he rigged the car at around 8 p.m., a couple hours before Kermit left. Wolf refused at first to help in all this, but as he put it, Marjorie stopped having sex with him. His angle was admittance to the murder, but very much from a place of manipulation. He was just a lonely, vulnerable working man who was made a fool by a pair of pretty eyes. Not to divert too much, but the story here does fall very much in line with what I objectively believe is the greatest film noir ever, 1944's Double Indemnity. The film follows Fred McMurray, an insurance man, manipulated by the seductive Barbara Stanwyck into helping murder her husband, allowing them to run off with his insurance policy. They even kill the husband in their car. Certainly there's some character variations, but the general storylines are definitely comparable. From there, before delving much further into Wolf's account of events, it's important to note that both he and Marjorie met in 1954, while she was still divorced, and their supposed love affair began before she ended up back with Kermit. Thus, a critical element of this plan was for Marjorie to win back her ex-husband's affections and become married once again. Obviously, how else would they obtain his life insurance money? This makes the whole story a little bit more difficult to swallow, as there was so much riding on Marjorie winning her husband back. And if he was so cruel to her before, why would she otherwise have wanted him back? Did he seem to change? Did she do it to bring their family back together? Or was it really part of this deep, dark plan? Even once the two were remarried, Wolf, obviously getting cold feet about committing an act of murder, tried to get Marjorie to just divorce Kermit again. But according to him, she wouldn't do this, as she felt with a second divorce that Kermit would take the kids away. Strangely enough, no mention of the life insurance policy she would have lost out on, which was the whole reason they were planning on killing Kermit in the first place. That said, Wolf also told authorities that one time, while making love, Marjorie told him that her husband was worth more dead than alive. Upon giving in to Marjorie's withheld affections, the early plan was for Wolf to shoot Kermit. A .38 pistol that belonged to Kermit, originally owned by his former police officer father, was found after the murder hidden in a ceiling panel in Wolf's apartment. He claimed that Marjorie gave it to him, and unless he broke into the Smiths' home completely unnoticed, stealing the gun himself, then it stands to reason Marjorie gave it to him. However, it may be worth mentioning here that, among many other things about to be discussed, something discovered in Wolf's possession was a set of keys to the Smiths' home. Why would he have these keys? Did Marjorie give them to him? It sounds absurd to think Kermit would. When the matter was brought up, Marjorie admitted to being rather lax with her keys, something that could explain how Wolf gained them so easily. She also admitted that they left the back door to their home unlocked frequently. Strange for a Kermit who was said to be fearing for his safety, but also something that was fairly common at that time. But having these keys on his person shows that Wolf, for a time, had easy access to the home, at which time he could have done a good many things, including stealing Kermit's gun. The two had tested a rifle prior to this, but Marjorie felt it made too much noise. According to Wolf, the idea was to go to Smith's office on a workday when his secretary was out, and he could simply shoot Smith without anyone being there to see it. While it's unknown exactly when this .38 pistol went missing, it may have added to a growing sense of danger and unease that Kermit just happened to be feeling in the weeks leading up to his death. Again, there was the March 10th attack by Wolf, but again, he knew who was responsible for that attack, and it appears his concerns went beyond that. He would tell a friend, Stephen Emery, less than 2 weeks before his death that he felt he was being watched 24 hours a day. Could his sudden vanished gun have added to this? Or was this potentially unrelated to his actual death? While there's been no evidence to show this, as an attorney, Kermit worked a job that could easily draw hostility towards him, either from someone he helped put away or even a disgruntled ex-client of his. Had his death been a bit more mysterious, this aspect of Kermit Smith's final days may have bore greater significance. Wolf would later admit at trial that, after passing on the shooting option, Marjorie also suggested the possibility of hiring a homeless person to kill Kermit. But Wolf resisted this, suggesting that he'd probably just have to kill the killer afterward to guarantee his silence. And then, the effort to beat the lawyer to death in his own garage. A very half-cocked effort, it would seem. Or so it would seem. At first, this just seemed like a random attack, but later Wolf would admit it was actually the first part of a more elaborate plan. Upon knocking Smith out in his garage, he would stick the body into Smith's own car and drive him out to the Crown Point area in the Columbia River Gorge, east of Portland. Once there, he would shove the car over a cliff and let gravity do the rest. He said he even bought an old car and stashed it nearby so that he could drive back to town afterwards. Another briefly considered possibility was that Wolf would sabotage a tire on Smith's car and then shoot him when he pulled over to try and fix it. To add to the idea that this attack in the garage was more than just a fumbled assault, Wolf said that Marjorie kept the family dogs locked inside so they wouldn't intervene. And even Smith himself would tell a client afterward that he noticed the dogs had been locked up, which they'd never been before. The officer who went to the Smith's home after this attack also overheard Smith questioning his wife as to why the dogs had been locked up. Despite this, Wolf couldn't even get past the first stage of the plan, overpowered by the larger, stronger Smith. So it was on to something even a little bit more elaborate. And another plan wherein Victor Wolf would have to do all of the dirty work on his own, either because he was, in fact, acting alone, or because Marjorie had manipulated the situation to work out that way. Wolf would say that they got the idea to rig Smith's car with explosives from a case out of Texas where dynamite had been rigged to a vehicle starter. While they never referenced the specifics of this case, doing a little searching, it appears Wolf was referencing the case of a James H. Hill, a dairyman who was blown up in his truck on April 15, 1952, in the town of Childress, Texas. The specifics included that the explosives had been connected to the truck starter. The similarities between this picture, depicting Hill's truck afterwards, and the pictures of Smith's car afterwards, is uncanny. Little could anyone in this small North Texas town have known the ripple effects this event would have just a couple years later in Oregon's largest city. Wolf said that he obtained 36 sticks of dynamite in total, as well as the charges from 2 different locations in the vicinity of the town of Molalla, south of Portland. At this time, any person could purchase dynamite, something that was still the case years later in 1970 when Portland City Hall was bombed by an unknown assailant, an event that shined a light on how easy it was for the everyday citizen to purchase deadly explosives. Wolf also obtained wiring to connect the explosives to Kermit's starter, the same type of wire being found along with bolt cutters hidden behind the instrument panel in Wolf's car later on. Once these key explosive pieces were gathered, an important piece of Wolf's story included testing these items. Granted, this occurred after a solo effort on Wolf's part, where he failed to wire the explosives properly. This part of his story was at least potentially verified by witnesses. At least 2 witnesses would say they saw Victor Wolf with a woman, admittedly one they could not positively identify at first as Marjorie, venture out to a rural section of Washington state near the town of Woodland. But one of these witnesses, a bus driver named Fred Fritz, who pulled up by the car they were in, would say he couldn't identify Marjorie at her trial, only to later say it was her at Wolf's trial. Wolf's story was that Marjorie accompanied him out there so they could practice with these explosives ahead of time, and he would eventually lead authorities to the site where he said this all happened. And it just so happened that when Wolf also led police to a Malala store where he purchased some of the dynamite, records not only showed he had bought it there, but workers at the store also noted he visited there with a woman. Once again, if Victor Wolf had himself organized all this, obsessions with married women have driven many an individual to perform remarkable, if not deplorable, things. This is just another place he could have gone out to and blown a few explosives off, knowing someone nearby might hear it. But he would have needed another woman to be with him, and one who looked like Marjorie. And if he wanted to be heard, why go to such a rural area? He then leads law enforcement there, and he looks credible. Was he being fully honest and trying to be cooperative with the cops, knowing he had been used by Marjorie, or perhaps having guilt for what he did? Or was he a degenerate character who took it upon himself to violently murder the husband of a woman he was obsessed over, and, to take it further, was trying his best to take her down with him, using her involvement and his cooperation to possibly get off light in the end? That's honestly the prevailing question. While out there in rural Washington, the remains of spent dynamite caps were uncovered. Wolf also said he plucked some pussy willows for his dearest love on the scene, which she took home with her. Pussy willow stems just happened to be found in the Smiths' home later on. This pussy willow angle was verified to a degree by Marjorie herself, who said that upon hearing Wolf was going to be visiting this part of rural Washington, asked him if he could pick some pussy willows for her. The wilting willows in the Smith home were compared to stubs Wolf pointed out to investigators on the scene, and they were found to match. But again, the relevance of that comes down to who one chooses to believe in this story. These pussy willows were ultimately found in a vase in the basement of the Smith home, first seen by Kermit's uncle Fred Margreth, who, upon hearing Wolf's story about picking them, decided to do his own investigative work. The fact that he did this alone suggests his suspicions about Marjorie and her potential involvement. Investigators ultimately picked more pussy willows from the site where Wolf took them to compare with the ones found in the Smith home. And they were found to match. And finally, with a little practice, Wolf seemed ready. He placed the dynamite under the driver's seat, saying he originally was planning on putting 10 sticks in there, but bumped it up to 12. He would later say, in this regard, that he wanted to make sure he got the job done so that Marjorie, as she put it, wouldn't be stuck taking care of a cripple for the rest of her life. He sure did pull through in that regard. And whatever he had left, he said he took up into the woods of Forest Park, discarding some along Cornell Road and the rest a little further north along Germantown Road. While some of these aspects of Wolf's story did not come out until the trial, within 24 hours of the explosion, they already had a lot, including physical evidence that had been recovered. On April 25th, Kermit's funeral would be held, with a memorial at the Chapel of the Colonial Mortuary, located once on Northeast 14th and Sandy Boulevard. With the heat already on her, Marjorie attended this gathering, wherein she fainted after complaining of abdominal pain. A doctor's check on her revealed there was nothing wrong with her, but still, under the circumstances, especially if she wasn't involved, it makes sense to faint at your spouse's funeral. But still, perhaps she was doing her best to gather sympathy on the outset. It just so happened the following day, a grand jury would indict both Marjorie Smith and Victor Wolf on murder charges. And early on, it seemed if he was just trying to throw Marjorie under the bus, that things might actually go Wolf's way. The push early on was to seek out the death penalty for Marjorie and perhaps go a little lighter on Wolf for being a cooperative witness. Remarkable, no matter what, considering he himself admitted to being solely responsible for the actual cause of death. Marjorie's defense was fairly simple. Everything Victor Wolf said was a lie. She hung around with him a little bit, but that was it. Otherwise, she found him to be simply a repulsive old man. Her defense claimed that the police had questioned her for nearly 2 days without any food, and while putting her under sedatives. Wolf had been asked to come out and construct the swing set at the Smith home, and he used this opportunity to rig the car with explosives, only Marjorie had no knowledge he had done this. And from the beginning, Marjorie's defense would argue the notion that Wolf was potentially insane, just a loony old loner who blew a man to pieces only to openly admit to it hours later. A man who twisted love into hate, driving him to murder. But his was still a story where, while he'd yet to definitively implicate Marjorie, everything he said that could be proven truth or fiction had turned out true. While the indictment was quick to come down, a trial itself would face constant delays. Because of the attention this killing had received, it would be difficult to get an impartial jury for the widow, in this case, in Portland. Everyone had heard and read about the car bombing of Oliver Kermit Smith. This would lead to her trial being relocated out west to the town of McMinnville in Yamhill County. Wolf's trial, held afterward, would be held in Portland, but in his case he had already admitted to his guilt in the crime. But a relocation hardly changed the fact that these trials, combined, were already set to become the co-trials of the year for the city of Portland, albeit one of them was conducted outside of Portland. With all of the pre-trial drama, the proceedings for Marjorie Smith finally began in the Yamhill County Courthouse in October 1955. On the outset, Victor Wolf already had things stacked against him, since he'd talked himself into a murder charge and could only hope his cooperation would be appreciated and that his story would be believed. The case against Marjorie still had to be proven, with her defense pushing the notion that Wolf was flat out insane. But they had their work cut out for them otherwise. As the trial went on, it was made clear that whatever one thought about the scruffy car-bombing Wolf, the charming, wide-eyed widow would be revealed as a woman with a questionable past. Thomas Marlin, a friend of Marjorie's since they worked the shipyards together during World War II, would testify that she tried to convince him to be the driver of a car while another man shot Kermit to death inside. Marlin refused, but Marjorie made it clear to him that she already had someone in place to do the killing. Victor Wolf, perhaps. Marlin also said that this conversation occurred only days before Kermit Smith met his maker, and this was not the only time that she brought up this subject of killing her husband. And if we go even further into Marjorie's past, to her days in California, there are a few more problems. It was revealed that even as of 1955, she was still wanted on bad check charges in that state. In 1941, she married her first husband, Merrick Frederick Hersey. Theirs was a somewhat rough marriage, destined to end. Marjorie claimed money inherited from her grandmother was taken by Merrick, who went and spent it on other women. At trial, he would testify that, in 1952, Marjorie posed an odd question to him. Working as a lab tech, she asked him if he had anything in his lab that could kill someone and be undetectable afterward. The two would divorce, with Merrick noting that he heard she traveled a great deal, including a stop in Hollywood. On a side note, looking at her info on Ancestry.com, I found a few glamour shots of Marjorie, marked as being taken in Hollywood in the late 50s. I don't know if this was perhaps part of an effort on her part to break into the Hollywood scene, or if she was just having some fun in the film capital of the world. But this divorce was not the end of Marjorie's experience with her first husband. After she started a relationship with Kermit and was pregnant with their daughter Susan, she went on multiple getaway trips with Hersey to Miami and then San Diego, wherein they posed as husband and wife. Upon learning of her pregnancy, Hersey broke things off, leading to an angry Marjorie showing up at his home in Sacramento and telling him he was Susan's real father. While it seemed she just did this to scare her ex, hospital records listed Hersey as Susan's father, with the birth certificate showing that Smith was the actual father. When the question of Marjorie's unshakable love for Kermit was called into question in relation to these particular events, she evaded the question, acting as though she didn't understand it. She would also admit to having a child out of wedlock in 1946 that she put up for adoption, the pregnancy being the result of an attack on her in San Francisco in 1945. A search of San Francisco criminal records revealed no information about her case, but many victims of crimes such as this do not report them to the authorities. A California friend of Marjorie's, Violet Renshaw, described her as a liar and a dreamer who appeared to see her husband Kermit more as a meal ticket than a husband. Spending some time in New Orleans as a tour guide, Marjorie appeared to miss this greatly while also boasting about it to a point that she began to alienate some of her California friends. Renshaw also called her extremely neurotic and manipulative, and that she always claimed to be broke, at one point even trying to take out a fraudulent welfare claim and giving up on it once an investigation started on the matter. Another word Renshaw used to describe Marjorie Smith was unbalanced. And even Merrick Hersey said, despite his shock in hearing claims that she was involved in the bombing of her husband, that she was a sick woman who needed psychiatric help. In the summer of 1949, she married a man named Michael Landers Brandt, and the two were together for just under 2 years, getting divorced in the spring of 1951. Overlapping this period, a man named Jack Dement said he had been seeing Marjorie, who he knew as Chris, regularly, even passively calling her a girlfriend. He knew her as having a fascination with diamonds, even planning on going on an expedition to find them in Africa. She tried getting Dement in on this, as she visited him at his workplace periodically, sometimes with Victor Wolf in her company. Dement said this expedition never happened, presumably because Marjorie gave up on it after marrying Kermit Smith. Marjorie would later say herself that she didn't go because she got the flu. None of this painted a positive picture of the recent widow, with the prosecution presenting her as a loose woman who'd been through multiple marriages and had a child out of wedlock, which at the same time implying the 1946 adoption was made up by her in order to garner sympathy. Despite all of this happening in her past, aside from the claims she is said to have made to Thomas Marlin and Merrick Hersey, it was still not definitive evidence of her involvement in her husband's murder. But obviously, the prosecution was trying to validate Victor Wolf's story, which required them to believe that Marjorie Smith was a master manipulator who took advantage of him. Wolf would be quoted to say around this time, "I don't know if you know this woman. She has a compelling personality. She's well educated and, how should I say it, quite a bit of a charm." On her end, Marjorie simply denied everything in terms of Wolf's overall story, which one would expect from her, innocent or guilty. She acknowledged having briefly seen him as well as the mistakes of her past, even when it wasn't to her benefit. Her defense clearly wanted to emphasize her love for her husband while distancing her from Wolf as much as possible. Several witnesses were brought in to validate how happy the Smiths had been, as well as Marjorie's clear brokenheartedness in the immediate aftermath of her husband's death. And in regards to Wolf, while she said she felt sorry for him when she rented to him and called him helpful with random tasks before, on the stand she said she didn't want to rent to him because she didn't like the look of him, but she gave in because she needed the rent money. And obviously, her side wanted to show the whole Wolf love slave angle to be preposterous. As far as her story of the night Kermit was killed, she said he called her from the club saying he was done and should be home in about 10 minutes. She turned the porch light on, but after about 30 minutes went by, she became concerned. She ultimately received a call from a newspaperman telling her that there had been an accident at the country club. She then called the country club directly, wherein she got the full story as to what happened. Victor Wolf maintained his story of a love-slave type relationship, wherein the two of them planned out the murder while he carried it out. It was going to come down to which side the juries believed. After the jury of 9 men and 3 women retired to deliberate, they were out for approximately 15 hours. It was not an easy case to find a quick decision that everyone was going to immediately agree on. But when they returned, they came with a verdict of not guilty. And with that, Marjorie was set free and legally absolved of her husband's murder. With her trial done, she sought seclusion on the Oregon coast in the town of Tillamook. Wolf's trial began in December, and even with his admittance to the crime, the jury would return a verdict of second-degree murder when a first-degree conviction was on the table. Wolf actually made use of a mostly forgotten, nearly century-old statute, wherein he claimed guilt from the start, but evidence would still be presented in the trial phase to help establish the punishment he would receive. The jury had no intention of reaching a verdict that would bring about Victor Wolf's execution, even going so far as to call such a decision unfair. And a second-degree conviction carried a mandatory life sentence, a sentence that Wolf reacted gratefully to, thanking everyone there and stating that he had no ill feelings towards Marjorie after all that had happened. One of the jurors, Juanita Reese, was quoted to say afterwards, "We felt it would not be right, in view of the circumstances, to have him executed." It seems pretty clear that at least the majority of the jury believed Marjorie Smith was the ringleader in all of this. Why else would a jury do everything they could to avoid a death sentence for a man who by himself blew another human being to pieces with premeditation? In the end, in the broad scheme of things, it didn't matter. Marjorie was moving on with her life and Wolf was headed off to prison. But Marjorie still had issues to deal with, namely her daughter. Kermit's sister, Ellen Hightower, had been watching over Susan in California while her mom was in jail and on trial and sought to keep custody of her, probably in part because she thought Marjorie may have helped kill her brother. A custody battle ensued, carrying over into 1956. In the end, the California District Court of Appeals awarded custody to Hightower, and this decision was highly affected by the Kermit Smith murder. They felt that whether Marjorie was directly involved in it or not, that she knew something about it and did nothing. And this was not the kind of person they wanted to turn a small child over to, mother or not. This fight would carry on into 1957, with Hightower still maintaining custody in the end. In later years, Marjorie would relocate back to California for a time and remarry to a man named James Sparger before passing away in 2001 at the age of 79. Despite his death sentence, Victor Wolf's first shot at a parole was granted, and just before Christmas 1962, he would walk away from prison. And a couple years later, he too would remarry to a woman named Leola Sweat. He would pass away in 2000 at the age of 90. Interesting thing, both Marjorie and Wolf died less than a year apart and were both living in Florida at the time. And Kermit Smith? Since 1955, he's been resting at Lincoln Park Memorial Cemetery on the edge of southeast Portland. From my perspective, having gone through all of this information, I'm of the strong opinion that Marjorie Smith was involved in the murder of her husband, either as the driving force behind it, or at least as an accomplice alongside Victor Wolf. That said, I fully understand the jury finding Marjorie not guilty of the crime. There's absolutely room for reasonable doubt on the matter, something one of Marjorie's jurors noted directly, and some of the strongest things against her could have been organized personally by Wolf. While the murder itself leaves nothing to mystery, what went on beforehand is still up to question. Beyond everything else in this case, there was one thing that has consistently stuck with me. This is the fact that Victor Wolf saw this plan through to the very end. He placed the explosives in the car and was out there shortly before Kermit left, rigging these explosives. And by his own account, he did this so that Marjorie could get Kermit's insurance money and they could run off together. A pretty important element of that would be both Marjorie and Wolf keeping quiet on the matter and hopefully flying under the radar. And yet, just a short while later, police show up at Wolf's place and he immediately spills the beans. Why? Was he just insane like Marjorie's defense tried to claim? Somehow I feel like that's not an adequate answer. But what made Wolf pull through with the plan only to negate its purpose only hours later? Addressing this question helps us look at some of the possible theories in this case. Had Wolf abandoned the bombing plans and authorities learned of it another way, I could understand him confessing everything a little bit easier. If Wolf felt that Marjorie was using him all along, I can understand him throwing her under the bus, but it seems less likely that he would go through with the bombing itself, seeing as he wasn't going to get what he wanted out of it. Maybe that was just it. Angered over being used, he went through with this heinous plan and threw himself to the wolves as long as he could try to bring Marjorie down with him. When it comes down to the idea of Victor Wolf being the lone guilty party, I feel the motive comes down to two possibilities. One, as mentioned, he felt used and manipulated by a woman he had clearly developed feelings towards, and he sought revenge for this. In the process, he killed off Kermit Smith, the proverbial man in the way, and thus was able to double attack Marjorie by making her look guilty and turning her into a widow at the same time. And then two, his motives may have been more driven by just getting Kermit Smith out of the way. Some, if I can't have her, then no one can vibes. This man meets a recently divorced woman, reportedly mistreated by her ex. He at least thinks they're developing a strong connection, only for her to just go back to said ex. And let's be honest, Kermit Smith was just about everything Victor Wolf was not, at least in the eyes of the average everyday person. But if his objective was just to get Kermit Smith out of the way, again, why throw your object of affection under the bus for it? These ideas both make sense to some degree. Men have killed for these types of motives before, but do they match with the mild-mannered Victor Wolf? Everyone who knew him, family and friends, described him as nice and down-to-earth, not a mean bone in his body. He had no criminal record, even though some newspapers tried, erroneously, to say that he did. Did he just get sick of being the nice guy and showed it with dynamite? Was he just a sad sack who, under the surface, just desired to be punished? If he did just snap, though, then why did he immediately regress back to being the timid man he'd always been before? Investigators, his defense, and even jury members noted how courteous he was. Even when he received his prison sentence, he smiled and thanked everyone for their work. So could Victor Wolf have acted alone? It's possible, but the reasons why he would have done it this way, I just struggle to believe. It already doesn't make a lot of sense that a guy like this would commit a crime so heinous, only driven by his own actions. But would being manipulated by another make this more possible? It would come down to how persuasive Marjorie Smith was, or how easily persuaded Victor Wolf was. This brought out a critical aspect of Wolf's personality at trial. One article described him as a good man, a law-abiding fellow, before he murdered Smith. Each remembered, however, that Wolf had no drive, that he was under the domination of both his wives. And Wolf's son from his first marriage, Gary, described him as easily led and dominated by his first two wives. And a daughter from his second marriage said her mom, Iris, was the dominating factor in their marriage. Wolf always backed down and gave in to her. So we have a man with a history of bowing to the desires of the women in his life. Thus, how hard would it have been for Marjorie Smith to get in nice with him and then get him to bow to her will? She may have even got the idea to use Wolf by seeing his relationship with his past wife, as they had children together and still saw each other from time to time. Seeing as Wolf was living in Marjorie's house, she could have seen firsthand how easily Wolf was overpowered by the women in his life. The possibility of a nice guy like this killing a man under the pressures of another woman might just seem a little more believable now. But we still have the question of, if he was being taken advantage of, and he thought he was going to escape with his new love, then why confess everything within hours of the bombing? I personally feel the strongest argument comes down to Victor Wolf as a person. As ironic as it may sound, I think this guy was a fairly moral person in most circumstances, albeit deficient, clearly, in other areas. To me, the strongest motivations for him to admit to everything as quickly as he did are either guilt or a broken heart. In terms of the broken heart, sure, Wolf could have figured out along the way that Marjorie was stringing him along, but still then, why go through with the bombing? There's one possible theory that I do not necessarily endorse, as there is no evidence it happened, and Wolf didn't even include it in his detailed description of events, even though it may have been to his benefit. With Wolf rigging the car to explode hours before Kermit left, could he have gone to the Smith home in a state of excitement, knowing Kermit was never coming home, to tell Marjorie it was done? He's gonna blow, we can finally be together. And of course, Marjorie, knowing she's about to get what she wants, lets the cat out of the bag, telling Wolf he's a fool, that she was never going to run away with him. Wolf is shocked, he's crushed, and he drags himself home where he waits in the dark for the police's inevitable arrival. Broken up, realizing he's been made a fool of, he ultimately decides his best shot is to be completely honest and hope in the end he gets a better shake than the new widow. Again, this is just a theory, but I almost wonder, as anticlimactic as it may be to some, if Wolf was driven to commit this act by Marjorie Smith, thinking he's doing something for the woman he loves and who he thinks loves him back, but he's also a timid man, a nice man, a man with no known criminal past. It probably explains why he failed so miserably in attacking Kermit in his garage weeks earlier. He's a man who's never killed before. And then he does it. He blows a man to pieces, and suddenly realizes he's going to have to live with what he's done. Lots of men, in the past and present, have convinced themselves that they are capable of certain drastic actions, only to be shattered by them in the aftermath. And murder's no exception. I could easily see Wolf sitting there at home, in the dark and the quiet, mulling over the horrendous act he'd just engaged in, being overwhelmed by it, and ultimately taking responsibility for it out of that guilt. Of course, to play the devil's advocate, the guilt angle could work if he had decided to do this all himself. But still, the circumstantial evidence against Marjorie Smith is still very strong. How does Wolf end up with Kermit's gun and keys to their house? Why did Marjorie have the dogs locked away when Kermit Smith was attacked in their garage? And why would Marjorie pressure Kermit to not pursue charges against Wolf for the attack? Why would she protect Wolf like that? Wolf's able to take police to the spot where witnesses saw him with a woman and point out the exact spot where he plucked pussy willow stems, and they match with the ones still in the Smith home. There were also two men, of whom there's no evidence they knew each other previously or banded together to make this joint claim, who testified in court under possible threat of perjury if they lied, that Marjorie approached them about being involved in the murder of her husband. One was a friend, Thomas Marlin, and one was an ex-husband, Merrick Hersey. And could there have been some animosity there between these men and Marjorie? Sure, but to the point that two different men decided to outright lie in court to try and get Marjorie Smith a death sentence? And in the realm of circumstances, while it is so difficult to know exactly what Marjorie Smith's level of involvement may have been, if she were completely innocent, one would think there would be something out there to at least mildly validate that. But the fact remains that while there's only circumstantial evidence against her, there is absolutely no evidence out there that proves she wasn't involved. On the flip side, everything about Wolf's story that can be proven has been proven to be true. And if Wolf acted alone, then this simple, mild-mannered laborer with little drive and no indication that he was particularly witty or stealthy put together a scenario so well planned out and detailed that it fooled some of Portland's most respected detectives, as well as a grand jury that indicted Marjorie, and almost a trial jury. All of these little things he had to plan out to a T, even to the point of willingly taking investigators to all the places he went to and putting items of physical evidence in places where they could easily be found. All of this, and not one slip-up, not one mistake, not one thing went sideways on him. Nothing that made investigators seriously question his story. Sure, he was ultra cooperative with investigators, so there may have been a willingness to want to believe him, but still, if he screwed up anywhere, it should have been noticed. People of much higher intelligence than Wolf, who plan out crimes for months, would beg to have things go this well for them if they did in fact do their crime alone, but wanted to implicate someone else. So while Marjorie Smith, whose main defense was just saying it's not true while giving flimsy or non-answers to many questions, may have thought she'd get off easy by having a so-called fool do her dirty work, perhaps she didn't realize how direct and honest this fool would turn out to be. So most of this video has focused on the story of Victor Wolf, as well as the possibility that Marjorie Smith was involved with him in killing Kermit Smith. And that has led to not really discussing a whole lot about Marjorie's side of things, because what she said was fairly straightforward. Victor Wolf is lying. Obviously, her narrative of events is she divorced Kermit. She was living in the house that they previously owned together, maybe still co-owned at that time. She took on Victor Wolf as a boarder. He obviously developed demented feelings towards her. She goes back to being with her husband. He's enraged. He wants vengeance. And logically, you could say he gets it on both sides by killing the husband who's standing in his way and then bringing Marjorie Smith down with him. He's this just demented lunatic. And nothing about his personality, albeit aside from blowing a man up in his car, really seems to vibe with that. But I did not come into this video with the objective of, I'm here to prove that Marjorie Smith was involved. There was no real preconceived notions. I knew the various details of this case, but I hadn't really thought it over that much. So I did not come into this looking to definitively go one way or another and be unshakable from that position. Going in, I was definitely suspicious of Marjorie Smith, and after going through it in far more detail, I'm even more so suspicious of her. But in ultimately coming to that perspective, I did try to have a moment of pause and think like, okay, what is there out there that really can be argued in Marjorie's defense? And I mean, there's obvious things out there, but pretty much all of them, this seems to be a running thing in the story, there's a counter argument that could just disprove that one. A key one that kind of bounced around in my mind was as far back as I believe 1952, and it was when Marjorie was with Kermit the first time, is when she went to her former husband, Merrick Hersey, and started asking about poison. And so it implies that a couple years before Kermit Smith died, Marjorie's already like thinking about killing him. So you'd think if she's trying to kill him, and she's trying to get all of his money, and all of his property, and all that stuff, why would she then divorce him? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, it could be she figured she couldn't pull it off, so she ends up divorcing him. Maybe she thinks there's someone better coming along later, and then as Wolf comes along and she kind of sees how easily manipulated he is, maybe this idea comes around that she can maybe win Kermit Smith back and use this guy to kill him. So you see, there's a counter argument to a logical argument, and that seemed to constantly come up every time I tried to find a reason here or there that would argue in favor of Marjorie being innocent. And even then, a lot of those arguments were circumstantial in their own right. So I still find myself at the end being of the perspective that she was directly involved in all of this. And one of the interesting things is that if the objective was she got together with this guy and they killed Kermit Smith so that she could get his estate and take all this money and go off and lead a nicer life. Well, ultimately, pretty much all of Kermit Smith's estate ended up going to their daughter Susan. So, oftentimes, the wife of someone who dies, if there's nothing suspicious about it, will get a good chunk of their estate. So it shows, I think, even in that regard, the courts that were making the decision in that matter, I think even they were suspicious of Marjorie Smith. And so they thought, I don't know if we can give this all to her because we're not fully convinced that she didn't kill her husband so that she could specifically get this. So we're going to leave most of it to her daughter. Good luck getting to that. As I said before, I understand the jury finding Marjorie Smith innocent, and in death, she remains innocent until proven guilty. It is only my perspective, based on analyzing the case, that she bore guilt in the death of her husband, and I believe I made a compelling case, even if it is still circumstantial. Perhaps she was innocent and Victor Wolf was this unprecedented mastermind, but I certainly don't think so. And I'm not alone. It's clear many believed in Marjorie's guilt, or at least that she had something like that in her. Despite being acquitted in her husband's murder, she still had her children taken away from her. And despite openly admitting to his murderous act, Wolf was even paroled his first time up and released from prison. By no means should this mean he gets a pass. Even in believing in Marjorie's involvement, no matter how his head was when it came to dealing with women, this sane man still made the decision to blow another person up. He was by no means a victim, regardless what happened to Marjorie Smith at her trial. But I did spend more time discussing the Marjorie side of things, as Wolf's involvement was known right away. But the main question that keeps some interested in this case still is, what was Marjorie's level of involvement? So while I focus a lot on her, I'm not giving Mr. Wolf a pass just because he was, quote, a nice fellow. 70 years on, and elements of mystery remain in the case of Oliver Kermit Smith, a war hero, attorney, a father, perhaps not the greatest husband, and finally, the victim of some sort of murderous plot. And those mysterious elements are unlikely to ever be fully resolved, leaving us to wonder what exact circumstances led from just another day in the life to this.